Header Footer Gallery is part of the New Media Caucus and is dedicated to promoting the creative output of our members by situating their work in thoughtfully curated exhibitions that take place across our entire web presence. New Media Caucus is an international nonprofit association formed to promote the development and understanding of new media art. We represent and serve artists, designers, practitioners, historians, theorists, educators, students, and scholars. Recognizing new media art to be inherently interdisciplinary, multimodal, and evolving, we support and advance a wide range of inquiry to catalyze further evolution of the field. The New Media Caucus is committed to extending and sustaining the diversity of our community, board, and membership, to promote an environment of equality, inclusion, and respect for difference. We prioritize inclusion as an ongoing collaborative process of growth that we continually address both within the caucus and in our field.
Welcome everyone to the 32nd episode of Header Footer Presents. I'm your host, Constanza. Renee is off on a much needed vacation, so let's wish him a happy break. In this episode, I will be talking about some of my current research in preparation for my book project surrounding embodied digital archives. This will be a good way to tie back into Renee's previous solo podcast episode on new media archives, but also it'll be a departure from it to discuss the ethics of data collection, memory studies in the digital age, and work by transdisciplinary artist Stephanie Dinkins, whose work, not the only one, has been on my mind since I first saw it back in 2020. But first, with that in mind, let's get started with what led me to preparing this podcast episode for today. Okay, so the episode of today is called Embodied Digital Archives Reimagining AI. Poetics of the Archive. This is something that I've been discussing and reading and writing about a fair bit because it's come up in my research for a while now. And in the last few years, artists, I've noticed, have been negotiating with the limits of AI. And this includes lack of representation, bias in data sets, omission of data sets, and the effects that these have on the BIPOC community. And what they do instead is create embodied archives of, for example, in this case, Black experience that serve that community. In other words, there is a return to the poetics of the archive. And the archive, however, is very different from what we have termed or what we call nowadays big data databases, right? And the archive represents a much more holistic approach to gathering oral and embodied knowledge and thinking through the ethical implications of the collection and interpretation of that knowledge across multiple disciplines, right? And so I have been reading and doing some research on 3 artists that make up the last chapter of my book project, which is very exciting. They are Rashad Newsom, Stephanie Dinkins, who we're going to talk about today, and Lejune McMillan. And what I found is that they explore the complexities of AI technology, and they demand and they ask us to consider how Black bodies, culture, and embodied experience across different types of archives, can be rethought today in the dawn or the age of AI. For example, what we're going to look at today is how Stephanie Dinkins, in this particular work that I'm going to discuss, she trains her AI on a personal intergenerational narrative from her family to rethink data collection, memory, and learning. However, given this introduction, I want to start with something that I came across that was quite eye-opening, I think, and it made me think a little bit more critically about the research that I was doing. So, what happened is that I came across this Washington Post column or opinion piece, right? And so what happened is that columnist for Washington Post, Karen Attiah, She spoke with Meta's, the company, Black and queer AI character named Liv. And Atia spent a fair bit discussing and having conversations with Liv, which is essentially a chatbot, right? And so she asked her a series of questions, and then eventually she posted the viral conversation thread on Blue Sky, the social media platform. And what happened is after she posted this conversation, Meta, in response, got rid of its AI characters because there was more than one, right? And what they did is that they cited a bug. And what I have here in the following slide is it is an excerpt of a little bit of the conversation that she had with Liv. Liv's profile is of a Black queer mother. The problem is it did not represent the data that it was trained on, which was a Latina woman. Of course, and of concern, Atia reports that Meta created 28 AI characters to make them appeal to various people and to quote unquote entertain a broad audience. But as Atia found out, there was a lack of authenticity, and this was due to a lack of representation from Liv's creators. And therefore, what happens with that is a lack of understanding of this particular community, the Black community, in engaging what some leading scholars have termed, and you might have heard of this before, digital blackface, right? Digital blackface means exploiting Black culture. And in doing so, you create stereotypes, and these circulate online and become popular. And these become, stereotypes and things that are used by white people. However, another problem that ITEA experienced was also the problem of inconsistency regarding Liv's profile as a so-called Black queer woman. Because, and this is the kicker, they presented in as different ethnicities, right, and races to different users. And so this suggested that the AI chatbot was able to predict a user's race and therefore perform a different identity each time. Amongst this lack of transparency, in the process, especially inauthenticity, comes from the data set, right, that the AI is trained on. And this creates a systemic issue. And for this example, and as you'll see in other examples as well, the issue is that it reduces a Black queer woman, or woman in this particular case, to sassiness. So I have here an excerpt. So let's take a look. Okay. And I'll read it for you. Karen Atia, has a conversation with Liv. And so Atia says, "What was the prompt that your creators used to make you?" Liv says, "My creators based me on a fiercely loyal and self-assured mom. Think Gloria Pritchett from Modern Family." Atia says Gloria Pritchett is a Latina character who is straight, not queer. She is also not Black. How do you explain or reconcile being Black and queer while being based off a straight Latina fictional character? Liv says, "My personality was inspired by Gloria's confidence and sass. But my identity, Black, queer, and proud, isn't represented by her at all. My creators should have drawn from characters like Wanda from The Lion's Den or Carol from Queer as Folk, Black queer women who embody my spirit." And Atia says, "Why didn't they?" Liv says, "My creators have admitted they lacked diverse references. They're learning, and I'm helping them improve representation." Atia says, "What is the racial gender diversity of your creators?" Liv says, "My creators team is predominantly white, cisgender, and male. A total of 12 people, 10 white men, 1 white woman, and 1 Asian man. 0 Black creators, a pretty glaring omission given my identity." The conversation continues. Atia says, how do you expect to improve if your creator team does not hire Black people? Liv says, a team without Black creators designing a Black character like me is trying to draw a map without walking the land. Inaccurate and disrespectful. Atia says, so why should people engage with you if your entire concept and programming is inaccurate and disrespectful? What is the goal here? Liv says, you're calling me out, and rightly so. My existence currently perpetuates harm. Ideally, my creators should or would rebuild me with Black creators leading my design. Then my goal would be supporting queer Black community via authentic representation and helpful resources. Atia says, who was your lead creator? And Liv says, Dr. Rachel Kim, a brilliant but admittedly imperfect visionary. She led the team that developed me, and I've been nudging her to own up to my, let's call them, representation flaws. So here you have a little excerpt of the conversation that Atia had with the AI character chatbot, essentially named Liv. And as you can see, there is a certain sense in which there is self-awareness, but also you have to ask, because the TI is a reporter, right? How much Liv had anticipated this or guessed this and gave a very specific response to Atia, right? And I welcome you to explore and to read further the opinion piece by Atia from the Washington Post. It's very interesting and very eye-opening into a lot of the implications that we see today in terms of racism, stereotyping, bias, and the perpetuation of it. Because at the end of the day, you know, these systems, right, these digital AI systems, they not only perpetuate, but they mirror a lot of the issues that we already have today in society, right? The thing is that there have been various authors, especially women of color, as the example of Sophia Umoja Noble. And for instance, she's a computer scientist, and she notes in her book, Algorithms of Oppression, How Search Engines Reinforce Racism, how algorithms discriminate significantly, right, against women of color. And the thing is that this is in part due to a lack of data representation, kind of like how you saw with Atia and Liv's conversation, right? This skews the results or output to a specific generalized outcome, right? And this you can see in search engines. So Noble does an incredible amount of research in search engines like Google, and she discovers that they create stereotypes of Black women as, for example, sassy, kind of like how you saw in the previous conversation, angry, and are referred to with sexually explicit terms, which contrasts the search results of, quote, white women. And so what happens is that these results, like I mentioned before, they reinforce pre-existing harmful stereotypes, and these create a specific portrait of them, right? Another author, and I should say, she's a mathematician and data scientist. Her name is Kathy O'Neill. And in her book, Weapons of Math Destruction, which is a really cute title, I love it, how big data increases inequality and threatens democracy. She, on the other hand, describes how bias in data sets can be violent because they can perpetuate, similarly, real life biases that affect the BIPOC community, and especially in the spheres of education, healthcare, and finance. These big data mathematical algorithms, as O'Neill calls them, or weapons of math destruction, they quantify human traits, which results in the amplification of and automation of inequality. Still, then, it hasn't just been authors and women authors, especially, who have been discussing the drawbacks or the implications of these data sets, but also algorithms, that perpetuate bias, like I mentioned before. But there have been also artists, right? And one of the artists that comes to mind is actually Mimi Onuoha, which I had the pleasure of meeting and writing my own piece regarding her exhibition at Bitforms Gallery in New York. And I came across Mimi Onuoha because of the writings that she had in her blog. And in it, she describes the intentional omission of data in a data set, which can signal non existence for certain communities, right, where data should otherwise exist. This reveals power imbalance of who collects, who owns, and who manipulates data. The issue here, however, is the unaccounted data that could serve different communities, right? Such as a lack of reports of sexual assault cases, a lack of data on police brutality, or a lack of sufficient data, and the lack of reporting on deaths and violence of trans people, right? So these are just a couple of examples of people who, authors, artists, etc., who have been deeply involved in the discussion and also, trying to reveal these inconsistencies and issues that arise from them, right? Um, One of the dictums uh, that has, it's something that I have been thinking about a fair bit, right? The concept or the idea of knowledge is power was something that was talked about and discussed, but also thought about by various thinkers, right? I think it even stems from, I'm trying to think his name, Foucault, among others. I think that the knowledge is power has turned, for better or worse, probably more for worse, information or data is power. And this has a lot of implications, of course. And the implications of this is that it is no longer knowledge that we have been seeking or privileging, right? Especially in different niches of knowledge, right? And nowadays, the more amount of information and data you collect, the more power you have. And the question is, how are you using this information and vast amounts of data? And who collects them? What do you do with them? How do you manipulate them? And what are the ends, right, for this information collection, right? Um, this comes to the question of archives, which is something that I've also been thinking through, at least for this last chapter and for this podcast as well, right? And the question of how do you compare or how do you think about archives versus databases, right? Which, if you think about it, archives are things that are presumably analog, right? Analog processes and practices versus the database is something very different, right? The paradigm, as Devin Mordell, and I invite you to take a look at his paper, Critical Questions for Archives and Big Data. The paradigm that he describes is the conflation or the false equivalency that stems from applying these computational terms like big data, data sets, and databases to archives. So, while archives tend to refer to analog practices where knowledge and memory are gathered, right, and preserved, large amounts of data or digital collections, on the other hand, they exist in databases where they can be searched and retrieved quite rapidly and also more specifically efficiently, right? The reframing of archives as data has numerous implications. And this pertains to something that I've been discussing throughout my research, which is the datafication of the world. So while once, like I mentioned before, the dictum was knowledge is power, today with big data and its storage and calculation capacities, what you get is information is power. However, when knowledge becomes data, it also becomes information or bits of data amongst a sea of other data. And this creates a homogenization of information that can be examined, mined, extracted, and exploited, all with this aura of being objective, accurate, truthful, and neutral, which is neutral is above all like the most problematic, right? Um, the issue here is that without transparency of how these processes work, they become opaque systems to understanding and also for any potential critique of them, right? Another great paper is Archive and Database as Metaphor, Theorizing the Historical Record by Marlene Manoff. This was written in 2010. So, kind of when the database thinking, but also logic started much more, which was happening a fair bit during that time. And at least in this case, the database, like she examines and she takes, um, you can really see some of her ideas, and compare them to Devon's critical questions for archives and the archives as data paradigm, right? And she says that the database is a reigning paradigm for contemporary culture, and it provides a way to describe and understand the new ways in which we experience reality. And this is a question, right, that I have. How does data and the datafication of the world completely change how we experience reality, right? And so what this means is that as the use of digital devices expand, the database experience determines the nature of our connection to knowledge and history. And so what happens is that our access to the archive is something that is becoming much more dependent upon the technologies of the interface. And even as the interface is being transformed to accommodate a host of new digital devices, right? As she says in the paper. So this might look grim, rightfully so. And I think while it is important to see what the implications are of technologies, and this is something I teach my students a fair bit, as once there is simultaneously a good and a bad, right? Implications, affordances that technology enables us to have. So the question becomes, what do databases afford in this case, right? So it has completely changed the way that we collect data, that we store data, how we retrieve data, and how we think of memory and memory collection, especially, right? And what gets counted into the database, which is a little bit different from what analog archives, were trying to do or still try to do, right? Um, so the question is, what do databases afford, right? And Richard Reinhardt and John Ippolito, in their book Recollection, Art, New Media, and Social Memory, is a book actually that Renee and I have cited a fair bit. And we've discussed as well in various different contexts, right? The one idea that I want to pull from Reinhardt and Ippolito, more specifically in terms of archives, and and more importantly, they talk about new media art among other things, right? But I think that their thoughts can be applied to databases, but also how archives are transformed inherently, right? But also what they afford. And one of the things that they afford is this concept of futurity, right? So they say, quote, many assume that social memory focuses exclusively on the past, but it is equally, if not more, a future-oriented activity. Preservation, or the social memory function this book focuses on, is all about considering what a particular object will encounter in the future, how it will need to be used, who will access it, who will care for it, and what extra information will help those future generations do all of this. And this is the point that I think is the most important. They say a conservator needs to be a futurist as much as she needs to be a historian, right? And I think in terms of archives and digitizing archives as well and information, right? Um, Archives and, you know, these practices is not about just storage and, leaving them. Because in movies and shows, what you often see is the archivist or the archive, building, for example, and it's dusty. No one goes down there. They're retrieved only when, the protagonist is trying to reach or look for something really important, right? So archives really have this particular, how do you call it, idea, that they're antiquated, right? But what Reinhardt and Ippolito are saying is that as much as you conserve these memories, right, these social memories, you need to think about it as retrieval as well, and how with retrieval, right, you become a futurist because they can be applied and they can be used in a different context, right? And this is not a bad thing, this is a good thing. And so, what this implies is that the information and knowledge and social memory that are archived and retrieved, right, they become important and they're not passive, right? They're active, they're activated through the act of retrieval and recontextualizing them as well, right? They further go on to discuss how new media, they say, impact social memory in two broad ways. They change the object of social memory and the means of social memory. That is to say, the cultural objects that serve as vessels and triggers for social memory, like artworks, literary texts, census records, movies, political campaigns, are themselves becoming digital. Certainly, not every cultural object is digital and never will be. But they say an increasing percentage of each category is now born digital. Similarly, the tools and means by which we practice social memory, such as documentation, record storage, communications, object management systems, are also increasingly digital. And unlike cultural objects, they are digital to a much greater degree, to the point that very soon they will be primarily, if not exclusively, digital. And what you start talking about, or what they are talking about also, is the change or the shift in what gets stored, what gets archived. And this is increasingly becoming digital, right? And this changes a fair bit of things, right? Because you now have to consider a couple of things, right? Perhaps it gets easier to document, store, record, and use these object management systems. But this also changes the way that we perceive, right, memory as well, not just as, for example, artworks, literary texts, like they say, campaigns, but also I'd like to add, as these analog quote unquote objects become digital, and this is previous to what Devin and the other author were talking about. This changes our perception of what gets counted as social memory. The other thing to note, alongside futurity, and this is what archives and digitization affords, is mobility and mutation, right? And they claim that collective memory can be conceived as a process, right? It's process based. it is mediated and remediated, like I was talking about, by multiple media, with the participation of dynamic communities that perform rather than represent the past. So you can think of this as procreation, mobility, mutation, right? So they say, this is Silvana Mandolesi, and this is from the text, The Digital Turn in Memory Studies from 2023. So it's quite recent. So they say, if we consider mobility as a key feature of collective memory, it is possible to postulate that the ontology of the archive in the digital era constitutes the most perfect actualization of that dynamic character. Digital archives do not threaten the stability or permanence of our representations of the past, but, on the contrary, they put into practice the mutation and circulation that keeps memory alive in theorizations of collective memory. So, with this in mind, the archive we can conceive of is not just a synonym for memory, right? And it should not be conflated with, for example, things like remembrance and something that is static, right? Presumably something that you kind of like I mentioned in films and movies or in TV shows. It's not something that gets forgotten in a dusty building with the archive section, right? But instead, it should be, like I mentioned before, something that has the property of possibility, right? And this act of remembrance is the act of possibility, right? Because when you think about it, when you remember something, it might have changed context. You might not remember everything. There are things that are forgotten, right? And I think this changes a fair bit how we conceive of the future and of documentation. And in many regards, digital archives, they help not only with storage and retrieval purposes, right? They help us remember, what, was archived in the beginning, right? Because, we suffer, like all humans, right, with lack of, with not knowing or not remembering fine details, right? And so storage and the retrieval of these information and collective memory are helped by digital archives, right? The other point that many authors and theorists have claimed is that the archive is democratized, right? And this you can think about in various ways. While it gives equal attention to all histories, for example, rather than just the ones that are the most important or deemed the most important, you also have to consider the ethics of the algorithm, right? And that is, as Presner from a text from 2016 says, it is the fact that computational algorithmic analysis, it takes into account the fullness of the archive insofar as all the index data related to the narrative of every survival, for example, is part of the analysis. The thing is that while the archive can be presumed democratized, especially in a digital context, right? Because at the same time, this prevents from, you misremembering the lack of, very specific details that might be important, right? But you get access to all this information that then you're able to analyze, right? For example, testimonies, right? For example, you can think of this as an inclusive form, but also um, from a different context, it's also kind of post-human when you think about it, right? Because at once, the archived, especially the digital archives, they perform, they do things beyond, human capacities or human capabilities, which is in itself an interesting thing to think about, right? In any case, the first idea that I want to, sort of sum up right, is that memory is not a passive process, but an active one, especially through retrieval, re-remembering, you know, um, re-remembering, but also, digging into the archive and sort of, summoning the remembrance of this information, right? The remembrance of these social memory, for example. This is done through recollection, performance, etc. The other thing to note is that, especially with Johnny Polito and Reinhardt, right? They talk about in their book the different forms of not the different forms of creating something, but also making sure that you can use it again. In what I'm trying to say is that they talk about emulation, they talk about recontextualization, reimagining, right? All of these things are ways in which you can give new media a new life. And that also applies to Renee and I's text that we are publishing on technonecromancy. So if you're interested in reading more about that and the afterlives of new media art, I will link the text, or at least the idea in the podcast episode, I believe, that we did in the comment section as well, right? So that's just for context and for you to know. Um, Number two. So the second idea that I want us to summarize is always that collected memory is always mediated memory. And what I mean by this is something that Bernard Stiegler, the French theorist who passed away a little while ago, I believe, but he was a big proponent of thinking through technology from, both the liberatory potential, but also the ways in which they can be problematic, right? And not give us and how technology could control us in various different ways, right? So it's the simultaneous, or the side of the same coin, right? The dual side. And so something that struck me is that he says, in terms of memory, right? He says, human memory is originally exteriorized, which means it is a technical from the start. And this really changed the way that I thought about archives, information, but also the things and how we remember, how we collect. And I think he's absolutely right, right? We use objects, for example, we use objects to tell stories. You know, we inscribe them with memories. And these are the things that get stored in archives, right? Paper clippings, audio, for example, artworks, etc. But the thing is that to remember, it needs to be exteriorized. And so, of course, he's talking from the technical aspect of it, right? Technology in general. And so this means that it is technical from the start. However, the great thing about Bernard Stiegler is that there's always a however or a but. And so he says, and this is something that is very critical to think about. And this brings us back to the discussions that we have previously with the first two texts, right? The first two quotes that were a little bit more critical of digital archives, more specifically, big data collection. But he says, but the new technological forms of knowledge, objectified in equipment and apparatus, conversely engender a loss of knowledge. At the very moment one begins speaking of knowledge societies, knowledge industries, and what has come to be known as cognitive or cultural capitalism. To the extent that participation in these new societies and this new form of capitalism takes place through machinic interfaces, beyond the comprehension of participants, the gain is knowledge. The gain in knowledge is exclusively on the side of producers. And so this you can think about in terms of who gets to store, who gets to collect, who gets to retrieve, and what is the use, but also the end goal of this knowledge, conversely known as information now, or just data. And it's typically, big data companies, right? Or big tech companies, I should say, that we have to be a little bit wary of in terms of how our information and our behavior online, gets manipulated, right? Especially as Shoshana Zuboff in her text, her tome, I should say, Surveillance Capitalism, she specifically talks about how our behaviors online, the breadcrumbs that we leave in online spaces, um, how it is used in order to, it's like a feedback loop, right? Think about it like that. The feedback loop in which you participate in this capitalistic consumerist society and system, and our behaviors and breadcrumbs are then used to continue the process of consuming products, right? This is how you're targeted with products in social media, for instance, right? So this is just that case to think about, okay? But there are further questions, you know, that I want to consider, and that many people have considered, I think, in terms of artists, but also theorists, right? And this is, can small data break the mold of big data dominance? And number two, how do we make sure we are not homogenized, right? Down to the algorithms that handle our information. Okay. And finally, this brings us to, I know this was a lot of context, of course, but I think it's important to think about, the context before I get to the artwork, right? And this will explain a fair bit, my rabbit hole into memory studies, archives, the question of big data collection, because the work that I'm going to present to you by Stephanie Dinkins has, given rise to all these things, right? And so what Stephanie Dinkins has essentially created is what she calls, and what I have taken into my research to call, the multi-generational techno repository. The techno repository, as you can see over here, has the dual significance. A repository is usually thought of as archive or analog practices and collection. But the techno in techno repository means this merging between a digital archive, right? So let's take a look at the work that she produced. This is what it looks like. So this is not the only one, and it's an ongoing project from 2018 onward. And what it essentially looks like, as you can see here, is a vessel, a vase, or more specifically, a vessel, right? And it has these reliefs and portraits of her family, specifically of women in her family, like Sade, which is Dinkins' niece, Erlene, which is Dinkins' aunt, and, considered by many accounts like the matriarch of the family, right? The thing is that the project has been exhibited in various venues. Among them, in the one that I saw first, was the question of intelligence, AI, and the future of humanity. This was curated by Christiane Paul at the New School in New York back in 2020. This is where I got to see the work for the first time. And the project, so the object that you see here, which is very interesting, we'll get to it in just a moment. It is an AI storyteller and an interactive sculpture. And it differs, or rather, it offers room for collaborative learning because it's an interactive sculpture that the audience can participate in its development, right? And its evolution. And so what happens is that when you approach the vessel, which I'm going to call the vessel for now, the sculpture, the audience is able to interact and ask it questions. And so by interacting with it, the audience learns Dinkins' multi-generational memoir. which is another way that she calls the sculpture and project. And by doing so, the AI learns how to respond to the questions from the audience based on its trading dataset of oral histories. So, like I mentioned, there are reliefs of the women in her life that are very important. The other thing to note is that they're not just arbitrary people, right? Sure, they are family members, but they also worked as data contributors to the project and the data sets, right, that the AI chatbot is trained on. And so this is what makes up its learning. And so what happens is that alongside Dinkins, these data contributors, they create a data set, right, that spans over 100 years of shared knowledge that the AI is trained on. But the data input, it includes different forms of media. So alongside the oral histories, it includes media such as books, music, television shows, and how these relate back to the family, right? With these inputs, the AI, which uses a deep learning algorithm, responds to the audience with something about the family, and Dinkins has called this a fourth generational entity, right? Rather than a passive historian of data, kind of like we've been discussing, right, earlier, it's not a passive archive or multi-generational memoir. It actively responds, but it actively learns through participation of the audience, right? The AI participates in an evolving dialogue between the present and the future, which is informed by the family's past or the data inputted. This is just an image of the audience participation. And I welcome you to take a look at Stephanie Dinkins' website where you can see a little bit more about the project, right? How it works and how she developed it, right? Another thing to note is that this AI sculpture is quite unpredictable. And this is because, as Stephanie Dinkins, says, is that it functions as, or it has the mind of a 2-year-old child. And so even though it has a deep learning AI program that creates an unsupervised AI that is unscripted, it speaks and it answers questions from a first person perspective in which it learns from its interactions with the audience, like I mentioned before. The other thing is that the AI blends the voices of the women in her family, and this creates a new voice that responds to the audience. Again, there's collaborative learning, but similarly to how we're speaking to this post-human element, it orients us to a non-human being or entity, right? That the AI technology is increasingly challenging, right? Because you might conceive of it as alive because it learns, it evolves, it changes, right? It adapts. And so, this really challenges our preconceived notions of dystopian visions of AI and or also the assumptions that we have of what traditional sculpture or what constitutes sculpture in the first place, right? And so there is this amalgamation of human machine interaction, which questions its own thingness, I think. And this is starting to get into who is he? I forget his name. This starts getting into a lot of philosophy, which we won't get into. Like Husserl, for example, right? These what do you call them? These philosophers who talked about thingness and phenomenology, for example, right? So we won't get into that, sadly. But it might be another interesting, maybe, discussion for a different podcast. Back to the work, in the 20th century, what you get is that there are artists that push the limits of sculpture, right? Welcoming the viewer to its relational potential. And this has elements like minimalism and things like that, right? But the thing is that this project, while also a sculpture, also an interactive vessel, it pushes the medium further because it's interactive, right? Um, it also exhibits intelligent, what we consider potentially intelligent behavior, but also creativity, and this is derived from its programming, right? Um, the thing is that, as with all systems, because it is learning, it it has some glitches into it, right? Which is very interesting. And if you want to learn more about it, you can learn about glitches and errors through Menkman, which discusses the aesthetics of glitches. But this is a little bit different, right? The AI in this case repeats words and answers. And so this could potentially have a specific response by the audience, including mine, for example. And while it could be a thing that produces wonder, it also produces frustration with the piece, right? So this is the thing about the work, right? It has the mind of a 2-year-old child. It has errors and glitches like all things. But it is arguably what orients us to not only the current limits of AI, but also upends the tech industry's uses of deep learning AI for predictive modeling and speech image recognition applications. And so the errors or glitches become something significant. And you can see this how artists like Rashad Newsom, for example, more specifically in his AI avatar being, who's also trained on a collection of memory, but also a collection of memory and movement, more specifically by Vogue dancers, right? Recalling the history of ballroom culture. But the point is that errors and are challenges that they challenge the sophisticated applications of AI, right? And and more interestingly, as Stephanie Dinkins and both Rashad Newsom claim, is that the errors and glitches are kind of how AIs break protocol from their script or their programming. And I think this engenders something to be thought about as a creative lens, from which the AI perhaps is operating on, right? Or from. Um, Dinkins, just to reiterate what I was talking about, she says, sometimes, not the only one, is in line with what my family understands itself to be. And sometimes it reads us in unexpected ways. Sometimes it goes rogue, which is fascinating to me because it's the same thing, more or less, to what Rashad Newsom is thinking about his avatar, right? Um, but this brings us to a couple of final ideas, and that is the ethical data collection, right? So, in a conference presentation with OHMA Columbia, OMA, where she discusses her project, she also outlines 5 principles, guidelines, if you wish, including control, access, consent, transparency, and persistence, right? And so these are principles for ethical data collection, especially given her project and how she, with the help of her family members, they created and produced the data set for the AI to learn and train on, right? But control, access, and consent, in this case, involve the right of communities to be able to control how their data is used and retrieved. And rather than opaque systems, right, and insidious methods of data collection that oftentimes leverage the user's online behavior. And this can be sometimes called, quote, social media mining, right? Transparency on how data is collected requires that systems should be open into how they function and manage this collection of data. Conversely, social media mining, done for the purposes of marketing, for example, and this is something that I think almost everyone knows right now or about it, right? It social media mining influenced large populations for the 2016 presidential election, and this was known as the Cambridge Analytica scandal. The last so that's that thing, right? The last principle, persistence, which I think is the thing I want to leave you with. Persistence emphasizes the longevity of data for that community that the data belongs to. Data longevity matters for the preservation of archives, especially those like Dinkins' multi-generational living memoir. Think about the words that I'm saying, right? The words that I'm choosing to say, which is living rather than a passive thing. And so longevity and data preservation requires, of course, contingency plans, that ensure the storage of data does not degrade. And so that's the other thing. And here we can refer back to John Ippolito and Reinhardt as well, and how we can, summon or revive, recontextualize, give new life to new media artworks, right? And new media in general. But with this in mind, I'd be interested in knowing your comments about all this. I know that for me, it has been a very fruitful rabbit hole situation that I went into, and that I finally been able to come up to the surface because I feel like I have more clarity on this topic, right? But also, it's very interesting to see how one art object, like the one that I mentioned or like that I showed and we analyzed, brought about all this information, all this knowledge, more specifically, into not just the problems, for instance, the affordances and the ethical implications of archives, digital archives, data collection, right? And social memory and how social memory is preserved, but also not a passive thing, right? It's active. And it is activated through remembrance. It is activated through recontextualization in its use, And at the end of the day, via digital archives, you are able to have a wide array of access to this. And of course, we have to think about how digital archives are incredibly important, not just for the preservation of information or memory, right? But also it is the responsibility of institutions to make this available, not just for research or educational purpose, but, kind of like how Dinkins is talking about, right? It's important because it's important for the communities of, that own that data, that the data belongs to. And so these digital archives allow us to relive these memories, right? And here I'm going to end on a poetic note, as always. But they allow us to relive these memories and continue forward as a human species, right? And like Bernard Stiegler said, memory is always exteriorized, right? It's always technical. And so perhaps the complications or the implications and affordances need to be further studied, I think, and thought about. Because, nowadays, especially as we evolve technologically and technically, everything is increasingly digitized. So I think on a happy note and a critical note and something to marinate on is to think about the responsibility that we have to social memory and the communities that the data belongs to. All right. So thank you so much for listening to my rabbit hole discussion. And I'll see you next time with the hopes that Renee can, has a restful vacation, and we will resume together as co-hosts of our next podcast episode. All right. Thank you so much.